Alexander the Great was born in 356 BCE in the city of Pella, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Macedon. It was a city of rising power and grand ambition. He was the son of King Philip II, a brilliant military reformer and one of the most powerful rulers in Greece at the time. The young prince grew up in the shadow of a king who was remaking the world. From an early age, Alexander was exposed to the high-stakes games of military strategy and political leadership. He didn't just watch history being made. He was trained to lead it. His education was a blend of the physical and the intellectual. While he mastered the spear and the horse, he also studied under the greatest minds of his age, including the philosopher Aristotle himself. Historians generally agree that this unique upbringing in the royal court of Pella played a major role in shaping his future ambitions and his vision of a global empire. Join us as we explore 15 real, evidence-based facts about the man who would conquer the known world before his 30th year. Alexander was taught by the legendary philosopher Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers of ancient Greece. Their classroom was the Nymphaeum at Macedon, far from the distractions of the royal court. Under Aristotle's direct guidance, the young prince studied philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He wasn't just learning to rule people, he was learning to understand the nature of the world he would one day conquer. His education was encyclopedic. He was taught to see the logic in nature and the power of Greek thought, an intellectual foundation that would travel with him to the edges of the known world. Some historians suggest that this education deeply influenced Alexander's worldview and his enduring interest in spreading Greek culture. He famously carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, on every campaign. While his armies brought the sword, his mind brought the scroll. Wherever he went, he founded cities that became hubs of Greek science, art, and philosophy, changing the cultural map of the East forever. However, the true extent of Aristotle's long-term influence remains a fascinating topic of discussion among researchers. Was he a philosopher king or simply a conqueror with a Greek education? The debate continues. A young Alexander once achieved what seasoned generals could not: the taming of a massive black stallion named Bucephalus. It was a test of character that would echo through history. A Thessalian horse merchant had brought the stallion to the court of Pella, asking an enormous sum. But the animal was so fierce and uncontrollable that no one dared to mount him. Philip, losing patience, ordered the beast rejected. But the young prince, only a teenager, stood his ground. He claimed he could manage the horse where his elders had failed, staking his own reputation on a creature everyone else considered a lost cause. Alexander had noticed something subtle. The horse wasn't acting out of malice, but out of terror. Bucephalus was frantic, spooked by the erratic movements of its own shadow dancing on the ground. It was a moment of brilliant observation. Alexander didn't use force, he used understanding. He realized that to master the horse, he first had to remove the source of its fear. He gently turned the stallion toward the sun. He spoke softly, soothing the animal with a calm authority until the trembling stopped and the beast found its peace in the warm Macedonian light. To the astonishment of the king and his court, Alexander leaped onto its back and rode. Historians believe this story reflects his early confidence and the exceptional observational ability that would win him an empire. The horse and the boy were no longer just legends. They were an unstoppable force of history. Bucephalus would carry Alexander to the edge of the world. 336 BCE, the kingdom of Macedon was shattered by a single act of violence. Alexander became king in the blood-stained shadow of his father's assassination. At just 20 years old, he inherited a powerful but dangerously unstable kingdom. Enemies at home and abroad saw his youth as a weakness to be exploited. Revolts broke out across Greece as city-states sought to reclaim their independence. The empire Philip had built with blood was on the verge of total collapse. But Alexander quickly moved to secure his authority. He didn't hesitate or negotiate. He marched with a speed that paralyzed his rivals and demanded total submission. He ruthlessly suppressed revolts across Greece, making an example of those who dared to challenge his legitimacy. Within months, the boy king was recognized as the absolute master of the Hellenic world. Historians note that these early decisive actions helped establish his total control at home. He had proven his right to rule before a single soldier stepped foot in Asia. With Greece secured and his throne stable, he was now free to launch his larger campaigns. The world was about to learn the true meaning of Macedonian ambition. Alexander didn't just inherit a kingdom, he seized it. Those first brutal months on the throne were the crucible that prepared him for the conquest of an empire. Few names in history resonate as powerfully as Alexander the Great, a king, a conqueror, and a tactical visionary whose ambition knew no bounds. He didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a destiny to challenge the mightiest empire of his time, the Persians. To understand his legend, we must look at the moments where his genius was truly tested, battles where the odds seemed impossible. In 333 BC, Alexander met King Darius III for the first time on the narrow coastal plain of Issus. Alexander achieved major victories at battles such as Issus. He saw a gap in the Persian line and charged directly at Darius himself. It wasn't just luck. Historians suggest that his tactical flexibility and leadership were key factors in these successes. These victories weakened the Persian Empire and allowed him to take control of vast territories, from Egypt to the heart of Mesopotamia. But the final reckoning was yet to come. At Gaugamela, the stakes were even higher. Darius had chosen the ground and gathered a massive host. Strategic positioning was everything. Alexander intentionally thinned his right wing to lure the Persians into a trap, creating the opening he needed. The cavalry charge was a masterstroke. It was a gamble of epic proportions, striking at the very heart of the Persian command. With Darius in flight, the Persian Empire effectively collapsed. Alexander was now the king of kings, ruler of the known world. However, the exact details of battlefield decisions are still studied and debated. Was it pure genius or a series of calculated risks? Regardless, the legacy of young Alexander remains a testament to what a single mind can achieve when fueled by unyielding ambition. In the spring of 334 BC, a young king stood on the precipice of legend. Behind him lay a unified Greece. Before him, the vastness of the East. The air in Pella was thick with the scent of iron and wood as the greatest war machine of the ancient world began its slow, inevitable grind into motion. Alexander launched his campaign against the Persian Empire, one of the largest and most formidable empires the ancient world had ever known. This was no mere border skirmish. This was a direct challenge to the King of Kings, Darius III. A quest for dominance that would redraw the map of the world. His goal was simple yet staggering: to expand Macedonian influence across the seas and decisively challenge Persian dominance. 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, the finest warriors in the Mediterranean, began the long march toward destiny. The crossing of the Hellespont was a moment of profound symbolism. As Alexander stepped onto Asian soil, he cast a spear into the earth, claiming the continent as won by the spear. Historians generally agree that this campaign marked the beginning of his rapid expansion across multiple regions, from the shores of Troy to the banks of the Nile. The buildup was meticulous. Every supply line, every scout's report, and every tactical maneuver was calculated to dismantle a giant. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about a revolutionary way of fighting, a combination of the rigid phalanx and the hammer blow of the heavy cavalry. It would become one of the most significant military campaigns in history, shifting the center of gravity from the east to the west for centuries to come. The world was about to change. The age of the Hellenistic Empire had begun, forged in the fires of ambition and the march of the young king. Alexander's first steps onto Asian soil were just the prelude. The true tests of fire and blood were still waiting in the plains of Granicus and Issus. Join us as we follow the path of the conqueror. The march into history has only just begun. Alexander didn't just see a territory to conquer, he saw a civilization to inherit. In 332 BC, the Macedonian army marched into the land of the Nile, a place of ancient gods and monumental wonders. After defeating the remaining Persian garrisons, Alexander took control of Egypt without striking a single blow. He was welcomed as a liberator. In Memphis, the heart of ancient power, Alexander performed a masterstroke of political and religious theater. He was declared a pharaoh. This was no mere title. It was a reflection of local acceptance, merging the Macedonian conqueror with the divine lineage of the sun gods. His journey to the oracle of Amun at Siwa further solidified his legend, where the god himself reportedly confirmed him as his son. But Alexander's most enduring legacy in Egypt wasn't found in a temple, but on a narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean. He founded the city of Alexandria, personally tracing its boundaries with grain. He envisioned a metropolis that would bridge 3 continents. It later became a major center of learning and culture, the home of the great library and the world's most brilliant minds. This was the birth of the Hellenistic world. Historians view this period as a key moment in the spread of Greek influence across the East. It was a cultural blend that redefined art, science, and philosophy. Egypt was no longer just a province. It was the beacon of a new era. Alexander left Egypt to continue his march toward India, but the city he left behind would outshine all his other conquests for 1,000 years. From pharaoh to founder, Alexander's time on the Nile transformed the man into a god and the world into a global community. Our journey through the Hellenistic age continues. With Egypt behind him and the Persian heartland secured, Alexander's eyes turned toward the rising sun. The horizon was no longer a border, it was an invitation. Alexander continued his campaign deep into Asia, leading his men through terrain that had never seen a Greek shield. They were marching into the unknown. They traveled vast distances, from the arid plains of Bactria to the frozen, oxygen-thin passes of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Their world was expanding with every step. As they moved east, they encountered diverse cultures and environments, peoples whose languages and customs were as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. Reaching as far as the Indus River, the army found themselves in a land of monsoon rains and dense jungles, a far cry from the sun-baked hills of Macedonia. They had seen more of the world in 8 years than most men would see in 1,000 lifetimes, but every mile took a silent, mounting toll. However, the invincible machine began to show signs of wear. The spirit of the conqueror was still burning, but the spirit of the army was flickering. His troops eventually refused to continue. They were exhausted by years of constant warfare, thousands of miles from the families they barely remembered. The legends were no longer enough to sustain them. They didn't want more gold or more glory, they simply wanted to go home. At the Hyphasis River, the march stopped. Alexander pleaded, he threatened, and he retreated into his tent in silence. But for the first time, his men did not follow. Historians suggest this marked the practical limit of his expansion. The world was too large, even for a man who claimed to be a god. The journey back would be just as deadly as the journey forward. The dream of a world empire was meeting the harsh reality of human endurance. Alexander had reached the edge of the world, and in doing so, he had changed it forever. The march had ended, but the legend had only just begun. As the borders of his empire reached the Indus, Alexander faced a challenge greater than any battle: how to rule a world of 1,000 different voices. Alexander encouraged the blending of cultures between Greeks and local populations, realizing that a king must be seen as one of his own people. He adopted certain local customs, from the protocols of the royal court to the very clothes he wore, much to the shock of his own Macedonian veterans. But his most radical move came at Susa, where he sought to bind his two worlds together not through the sword, but through the blood of a new generation. The weddings of Susa saw 10,000 of his troops marry local women. It was a moment of unprecedented cultural fusion, orchestrated by the king himself. He promoted integration within every level of his empire, envisioning a future where the distinction between conqueror and conquered would slowly vanish. Some historians interpret this as a cold, calculated strategy for maintaining control, a way to pacify vast regions without the need for constant military occupation. By training thousands of Persian youths in Macedonian ways, he created a loyal force that owed its allegiance to him alone, not to old tribal loyalties. Others suggest it reflected a broader vision of cultural unity, a brotherhood of man that transcended the old borders of the city-state. Whether it was political pragmatism or a visionary's dream, the result was the same: the birth of a Greco-Oriental civilization that would endure for centuries. This period remains one of the most debated in history. It was the spark that ignited the Hellenistic age, spreading Greek influence from the Mediterranean to the Indus. The world was no longer small. It was a vast, interconnected web of ideas, trade, and faith, a legacy of fusion that Alexander left behind. From the court of Persepolis to the halls of Alexandria, the conqueror became the bridge between two worlds. The legend was now universal. Join us next time as we conclude our journey through the life of Alexander the Great. At the height of his power, Alexander the Great presided over an empire that stretched from Greece to India. But with such unprecedented size came unprecedented challenges that tested the limits of his leadership. Despite his success, Alexander faced immense difficulties in managing his vast and diverse territories. Distance was his first enemy. A decree issued in Babylon could take weeks to reach the borders of Egypt. Communication relied on messengers traveling across rugged terrain and often hostile landscapes. Every mile traveled was a chance for news to age or for vital orders to be intercepted by enemies. Local resistance was a constant shadow. Conquered peoples did not always embrace their new Macedonian lords. In every satrapy, the fires of rebellion simmered just beneath the surface of his administration. Historians note that maintaining control over such a large territory was a complex and uncertain task. The strain on the empire's resources was visible as gold flowed out, but stability remained elusive. Alexander sought to fuse cultures, but his own generals often resisted the blending of East and West. Political tension grew within his inner circle as the king adopted Persian customs and courtly rituals. The logistics of governing required a level of administrative genius that even Alexander struggled to sustain. The empire was a mosaic of different laws, languages, and religions that were hard to unify. Managing this diversity required his constant travel and personal presence in every corner of the realm. But one man, no matter how great his legend, could not be everywhere at once to hold it together. The legend of young Alexander is as much about the struggle to rule as it is about the glory of conquest. In the end, the vastness of the world proved a challenge as formidable as any army he faced. With the king's final breath in Babylon, the silence was instantly replaced by the deafening roar of ambition. Alexander had left no clear heir, and the unity he spent a decade forging began to unravel almost immediately. After his death, his empire did not remain unified. It was divided among his generals, the Diadochi. In the corridors of the palace, his closest companions transformed from brothers in arms to bitter rivals. This division led to a series of brutal and exhausting conflicts known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Across the vast territories he had conquered, armies began to mobilize, not against a common enemy, but against each other. Alliances were made in the morning and broken by nightfall as every general sought to carve out their own kingdom. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Macedon, the world was plunged into decades of civil war. Historians generally agree that this division marked the end of Alexander's unified empire. The dream of a universal realm died with him, replaced by a fractured world of competing Hellenistic kings. While his culture would spread, the political structure he built was shattered beyond repair. In the wake of the Titan, only the echoes of his conquest remained to guide the warring world that followed. When Alexander the Great drew his last breath in Babylon, he left behind the largest empire the world had ever known, but no clear path for its future. The unity he had forged through a decade of conquest began to shatter almost before the king's body was cold. After his death, his empire did not remain unified. It was immediately caught in the grip of his most powerful lieutenants. The men who had once been Alexander's closest friends were now bitter rivals, each viewing themselves as the rightful heir to his glory. It was divided among his generals, a partition that would set the stage for decades of bloodshed. This division led to a series of devastating conflicts that history remembers as the Wars of the Diadochi. Across every satrapy, from Macedonia to Persia, the forge fires burned day and night as the world prepared for civil war. The very veterans who had conquered the known world together were now forced to turn their weapons against one another. Political conflict was the new law. Alliances were made in the morning and broken by nightfall in a desperate race for power. No one was safe, and the bond of the companions was replaced by a culture of assassination and betrayal. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the East, the Hellenistic world was drenched in the blood of its own people. Historians generally agree that this division marked the end of Alexander's unified empire and the dream of a single realm. The empire was no longer a whole, but a collection of competing kingdoms, each ruled by a king who claimed Alexander's mantle. The legacy of the conqueror was shattered beyond repair, leaving a fractured map that would define the next 3 centuries. While the culture of Greece would spread further than ever before, the political machine Alexander built had ground to a halt. In the end, the legend of Alexander was all that remained, a golden memory in a world of bronze and blood. In the sweltering heat of a Babylonian summer, the man who had conquered the world faced his final silent battle. As Alexander's life ebbed away, a question of terrifying proportions loomed over his empire. Who would rule in his stead? Alexander never clearly named a successor. He held the power of the world in his hands, yet he left no one to catch it. This lack of planning was not a mere oversight. It was a spark that would soon ignite the entire Hellenistic world. The absence of an heir contributed to a profound instability that took root even before the king had drawn his last breath. To his companions, he supposedly whispered 3 final words: "To the strongest." But in a room full of titans, strength was a matter of perspective. His generals, the brothers in arms who had followed him to the ends of the earth, now looked at each other with newfound suspicion. Without a designated successor, the bond of the empire began to fray, pulled apart by the very men who built it. Historians continue to debate the truth behind this silence. Was it a calculated move or a tragic consequence of fate? Some argue it was intentional, that Alexander believed no single man was worthy of his mantle, or perhaps he simply could not imagine a world without himself. Others maintain it was the result of unexpected circumstances, a sudden illness that robbed him of his voice before he could secure the future. Regardless of the cause, the uncertainty left by his passing was a void that would be filled only by decades of blood and fire. No single explanation has ever been universally accepted, leaving this final act of the legend shrouded in mystery. In the end, Alexander's greatest legacy was not just the empire he built, but the devastating void he left behind. A conqueror who changed the world, but could not plan for a world without him. In the wake of his armies, a new world began to emerge, one defined not by the sword, but by the light of Greek culture. Alexander's campaigns helped spread Greek culture across a wide region, connecting disparate lands in a way never before imagined. This period is often referred to as the Hellenistic era, a time when the world spoke with a single sophisticated voice. Across the empire, dozens of new cities were founded, each a bastion of Greek law, architecture, and lifestyle. The greatest of these, Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual heart of the world, housing the collective wisdom of mankind. It was a cultural revolution that transcended borders, influencing language, art, science, and political systems for centuries. Knowledge became the currency of the age. Ideas from the East and West collided and fused into something entirely new. In the arts, the rigid styles of old gave way to a new humanism, capturing the drama and emotion of the human experience. Science and medicine flourished as thinkers like Euclid and Archimedes pushed the boundaries of what was known. The Greek language became the lingua franca, the common tongue that allowed merchants and philosophers to communicate from Athens to India. Even the entertainment of the era reflected this shift, as theaters brought the stories of the gods to every corner of the realm. Political systems were reshaped, blending the local traditions of kingship with the administrative efficiency of the Greek poleis. Historians widely recognize this as one of his most lasting impacts, a legacy that outlived the empire itself. Alexander may have built an empire of bronze, but he left behind an era of gold that continues to influence our world today. The legend of young Alexander lives on, not just in the records of war, but in the very fabric of our civilization. Today, Alexander the Great is remembered as one of history's most successful military leaders, a man who reshaped the world in a single decade. But beyond the borders of his maps and the reach of his spears, his legacy remains deeply and profoundly complex. Some view him as a visionary unifier, a man who sought to blend the civilizations of the East and the West into one. His dream was a world without walls, where knowledge and culture could flow as freely as the great rivers he crossed. While others emphasize the heavy cost of his conquests, the lives lost, and the ancient cultures uprooted in his wake. For every city founded, there were others that fell, leaving a trail of blood beneath the golden glory of his name. Historians continue to study his life as a powerful example of the weight of ambition, the nature of leadership, and the inevitable ripple of consequence. In every library and classroom, his story is retold, a map of what it means to reach for the stars and find the limits of humanity. He became a standard by which all future conquerors would measure themselves, a ghost that haunted the dreams of Caesar and Napoleon. His name has outlived the marble and the bronze, etched into the very foundation of the civilization we know today. The throne remains empty, but the void he left behind is filled with the enduring questions of power and purpose. Alexander the Great was not just a king of his time, but a titan whose shadow still stretches across our modern world. For in the end, the legend of young Alexander is the story of us all, our greatest dreams and our most human failures. A legacy written in the stars, forever echoing through the corridors of time.